Ruth Simmons was $387 short of her October rent when the letter from the City Housing Authority arrived, telling her that the building on Glenwood Avenue, where she had lived for 34 years, was being assessed for code violations and that residents would need to vacate within 90 days if the violations were not remedied by the landlord, whose name was Victor Chen, and who had owned the building for 6 years, and had spent those 6 years doing the minimum required to keep the inspectors from returning, which had worked until October, when an inspector who was newer than the others and less familiar with what minimum required looked like, had walked through the building on a Thursday afternoon and written down 31 violations on a form that Victor Chen received in the mail on a Monday morning and did not call Ruth Simmons about, because Victor Chen did not consider it his responsibility to call the tenants about things that were his responsibility to fix. Ruth was 80 years old, and she had been in that building since she was 46, and she had raised 2 children in it, and buried 1 husband in the years since she moved in, and she had grown collard greens on the fire escape every summer for 34 years, and she had not told anyone about the letter, because telling people about things you cannot fix is a burden you place on them. And Ruth Simmons had spent 80 years not placing burdens on people. What Victor Chen did not know, and what Ruth did not know either, was that there was a man who had been looking for this address for 7 months, and who found it the same week the letter arrived, and who was sitting in a car on Glenwood Avenue on a Tuesday morning in October, reading the number on the building, and thinking about a hallway in 1989. Kobe had been 13 years old. He had been running from something he would not name in detail, even 30 years later. He had been 13 and stupid, and in the wrong place with the wrong people, and he had run down an alley off Lancaster Avenue and up the back stairs of the building on Glenwood, and the door at the top of the stairs had opened before he reached it, and a woman he had never seen before had pulled him inside and closed the door and said, "Stay here," and gone back out to the landing. And he had heard voices, and he had heard her voice among them, saying something he could not make out, and then quiet. And then the door had opened again, and she had looked at him and said, "They're gone." And he had said, "Who are you?" And she had said, "Ruth Simmons." And he had said, "Why did you help me?" And she had said, "Because you looked like you needed it." And he had said, "Thank you, ma'am." And she had said, "Go home and don't be stupid." And he had said, "Yes, ma'am." He had gone home. He had not been stupid in that specific way. Again. He had thought about Ruth Simmons occasionally over the 30 years since, and each time he thought about her, he thought about a door opening before he reached it, and a woman who had not asked what he was running from, and had simply stepped back and let him in. And he thought about what kind of person does that, and what kind of person he would have become if the door had not opened, and he did not think about that part for too long. His foundation researcher had found her through Lancaster Avenue. Neighborhood records cross-referenced with a city directory from 1989 that listed a Ruth Simmons at the Glenwood Avenue address, and that same Ruth Simmons was still listed at the same address 34 years later. And Kobe had read that and sat with it for a long time. He drove himself. He parked on Glenwood and looked at the building. He could see the fire escape from the street, and there were containers on it, which in October were empty, but which had the look of containers that had recently had things growing in them. And he sat looking at the containers for a while, and then he got out of the car and walked to the front entrance and pushed the buzzer for apartment 6. The voice that answered the intercom was the voice of a woman who had lived alone for a long time and had learned to be careful about who she let in. "Who is it?" the voice said. "My name is Kobe Bryant," said Kobe. "I don't know if you remember me." The intercom was quiet for a long moment. The door buzzed open. Ruth Simmons was standing in the hallway outside apartment 6 when he came up the stairs. She was 80 years old and small and upright, with close-cropped white hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. And she looked at him the way she had looked at him in 1989, which was directly and without excess. "You got tall," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Kobe said. She looked at him for another moment. "You'd better come in," she said. The apartment was small and very clean, and had the specific quality of a place that has been inhabited by one person for a very long time, which is that every object in it is exactly where it belongs, and there is nothing in it that does not have a reason to be there. Ruth had her chair by the window, and a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen that smelled of something that had been cooked that morning, and photographs on the wall and on the fire escape outside the window, the empty containers. They sat at the table. Kobe said, "I have been looking for you for 7 months," and Ruth said, "Why?" And Kobe said, "Because you opened a door." And Ruth said, "I open a lot of doors." And Kobe said, "You opened one for me in 1989. And Ruth looked at him. "I remember you," she said. "I wasn't sure you would," Kobe said. "You were scared," she said, "and you were trying not to show it. And I thought, if I don't open that door, this boy is going to make a very bad decision." And she looked at him and said, "Did you make any more bad decisions after that?" Some, Kobe said, "But not that kind." "Good," she said. They talked for an hour and a half. Kobe asked about her life, and Ruth told him about the 34 years on Glenwood, and the 2 children and her husband James, who had died in 2009, and the collard greens on the fire escape, which she said did better than anyone expected, given the light situation. And she told him about the neighborhood which had changed and kept changing. And she told him about the building, and then she stopped. "What about the building?" Kobe asked. She looked at the table. "There's a letter," she said, "about code violations, and I have 90 days, and the landlord is not the type to fix 31 violations in 90 days. "How long have you lived here?" Kobe asked. 34 years, she said. She said it the way people say numbers that have become more than numbers. Kobe looked at the window and the empty containers on the fire escape. "I want to help," he said. And Ruth said, "I'm not asking you to." And Kobe said, "I know." And Ruth said, "I mean it." And Kobe said, "I know you mean it, and I want to help anyway." And Ruth looked at him and said, "Why?" And Kobe said, "Because you opened the door." And Ruth said, "That was nothing." And Kobe said, "It was not nothing." Ruth was quiet. She looked at her hands on the table. "It would need to be something real," she said. "Not a check. And goodbye." And Kobe said, "Tell me what real looks like." "Real," she said, "is someone making Victor Chen fix those 31 violations. And real is the rent coming down, because for 34 years the rent went up and my pension did not. And real is being able to stay here because this is where I live and I don't intend to go anywhere." Kobe's foundation director spent 3 weeks on Victor Chen. The City Housing Authority violations were public record. The legal pathway to require remediation was clear. The foundation connected with a tenant rights organization called Housing Justice LA, whose attorney sent Victor Chen a letter that was 14 pages long and cited each of the 31 violations by code number and gave him 60 days to remediate all of them with a licensed contractor whose work would be inspected by a city inspector, and made clear that failure to remediate would result in the city taking action that would be significantly more expensive than fixing the violations. Victor Chen called the foundation director on the third day after receiving the letter. He said he was prepared to make the repairs, and the director said, "Good." And he said it would take some time, and the director said 60 days, and he said he might need more time. And the director said 60 days, and he said he would also need to consider the rent structure. And the director said the current rent structure would remain unchanged for the duration of Ruth Simmons' tenancy. And Victor Chen was quiet for a moment, and then he said he would need to consult with his attorney, and the director said of course, and ended the call. Victor Chen's attorney called back the following Tuesday. The repairs would be completed within 60 days. The rent for apartment 6 would be frozen at its current rate for the duration of Ruth Simmons' tenancy. A formal agreement to this effect would be drawn up within 2 weeks. Ruth received a copy of the agreement by mail. She read it standing at the table in apartment 6, and then she sat down. She called her daughter in Baltimore and read her the relevant sections, and her daughter said, "Mom, who did this?" And Ruth said, "I had some help." And her daughter said, "From who?" And Ruth said, "A very tall man who came to my door." And her daughter said, "What tall man?" And Ruth said, "Someone I helped a long time ago." And her daughter said, "You helped a lot of people." And Ruth said this. One remembered, and her daughter was quiet for a moment. And then she said, Mom and Ruth said, "I know." The contractors arrived in November. They worked for 6 weeks, and they fixed all 31 violations, and 3 others they found in the process. And when the city inspector came in December, he signed off on the building, and the violations were cleared, and Victor Chen's building was for the first time in 6 years actually in compliance with the codes that existed to protect the people who lived in it. Ruth planted her collard greens in April. She put them in the same containers she had used the previous year, and the year before that, and the year before that, going back 34 years of springs on the fire escape of apartment 6 on Glenwood Avenue. And she watered them in the morning before the sun got too high, and she watched them come up the way they always did. And she thought about a door and a hallway, and a scared 13-year-old boy who had gotten tall and come back. And she thought that was what the door had been for all along. Kobe came back in May. He did not call ahead. He simply drove to Glenwood Avenue on a Saturday morning and buzzed apartment 6. And Ruth answered the intercom the same way she always did, which was, "Who is it?" And he said, "It's Kobe," and the door buzzed open. She had coffee ready when he came upstairs, which meant she had been expecting him, or had decided to be ready in case. And either way, there was coffee, and they sat at the table by the window and looked at the fire escape where the collard greens were already doing well for May. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Kobe said. She looked at the greens. "They're better this year," she said. "I think the new windows helped the light." "The contractors did good work," Kobe said. She was quiet for a moment. "Victor Chen called me," she said in March. "He wanted to know if there was anything else that needed attention in the apartment." Kobe said nothing. She looked at him. "I told him the bathroom faucet," she said, "has been slow to drain for 2 years, and it was fixed the following week." "Good," Kobe said. She picked up her coffee. I told my daughter, she said. And her daughter told her children, and her youngest is 11. And he called me and said, Great-Grandma Ruth, did a famous basketball player really come to your apartment? And I said, yes. And he said, which one? And I said, Kobe Bryant. And he said, no way. And I said, yes, way. And he said, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. And she looked at Kobe and said, I hope that's all right. That's very all right, Kobe said. She smiled, which was not something she did quickly or without reason. And he had now seen her smile twice, and both times it had the quality of something earned. She said, you know what? I told him. And Kobe said, what? And she said, I told him the reason he came back was not because he is famous. It is because he was raised right, and he remembered who helped him. And she looked at Kobe and said, I don't know if that's true. And Kobe said it is. And she said, good. They finished their coffee, and Kobe stood to leave, and Ruth walked him to the door. And when he was in the hallway, she said one more thing. And he turned, and she said, if you had not come back, I would not have asked. And he said, I know. And she said, I want you to know that. I know that you know that. And he said, okay. And she said, because it matters that you came back without being asked. And he said, I understand. And she looked at him and said, go home and don't be stupid. And he said, yes, ma'am. And she closed the door, and he stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of an 80-year-old woman moving back to her chair by the window. And he thought that was the same thing she had said to him in 1989 in this same hallway, and that some things did not change, and that those were the things worth finding your way back to. If this story moved you, drop your city and country in the comments below. And if you believe the doors people open for us deserve to be walked back through, please hit that like button and subscribe. Click the video on your screen right now for another story that will stay with you.